I'm just off the Irish International Business Network's first ever virtual event with Keith Barry and wanted to share a couple of insights that he gave to us. The purpose of his conversation today was to how to manipulate your mind so that you can boost performance, particularly in times like this. So one of the first things he said was that every month he has a reorientation day in a log cabin where he stringently goes through every aspect of his business, what's working and what's not. And he also said that he does that with a whiteboard, brutal honesty and deep thought, and recommends that we all do the same. He said we should all question if we're strong mentally right now, and if we are not, well then what we need to do is we need to shrink the negative voice and we need to boost or amplify the positive voice. And he gave us some techniques to do that. He said if you're trying to shrink the negative voice, he said imagine that you are in a cinema on your own, it's completely black, you're completely relaxed, and he gave us a technique about how to do a body scan to make sure that you are relaxed in doing this. And then what he said was, imagine that you are looking at this painful situation that possibly you're playing over in your mind. So then he said to project that onto the cinema screen. Then he said take the colour out of it, so make it black and white. Then he said take the sound out of it, so make it silent. Then he said reduce the size of it, down, 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 until it is the size of a postage stamp, and then push it away. He said if you want to amplify a message in your mind, he said go back into that cinema where only you're there. He said look at this big, huge screen to project like your ideal scenario there. And he said make it colourful, make it loud, make it vibrant, and then jump into that screen and to absorb yourself in it. So that particularly was what he said about how to do that. He shared some very tragic incidents that had happened in his life, and he went into a little bit of detail around how he overcame them, but particularly what he said was he puts himself into super activation mode, and this is where you put more time, more effort and more money into solving a problem. So one of those things was that he was in a car accident in 2007. His leg was completely damaged. It took 3.5 weeks for them to rebuild his leg, and they told him that he would have a limp for the rest of his life. So what he did was that he found the best physios in the world, and he particularly said that they would be working with football players, went over to Anfield and went to the physio there, and then he said that he had responded so much faster than anybody else. So he talks about that is rather than being reactive, is to throw yourself into this instead. He said that you need to sit and figure out your intent in life. He said, is it your family or is it your career or is it something else? And he said that it's important to form neural pathways all the time through neuroplasticity. And that particularly can be driven by figuring out what you want and then putting plans in place in order to achieve them. He constantly spoke about the impact of books. He said he's self-taught in everything, in hypnotherapy, in NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming. He also, of course, told us that he's a scientist. That was his degree that he got in NUI Galway. But he's self-taught in so many other ways. And he gave a number of books to recommend. The Greatness Guide, Mind Hacks, Tips and Tools for Your Brain, 30-Second Psychology, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, and Evolve Your Brain. He said we also need to be pretty brutal, he used that word a few times now, pretty brutal in understanding what drains you, and if there are people in your life that are pulling you down, he said to cut them loose. He also discredited a very, accepted wisdom that's out there, and that is that the number one regret that people have in their deathbed is that they didn't spend enough time with family and friends. He says that's not the case, that the number one regret that people have is that they didn't follow their dreams and their goals, and that the second one is actually not spending time with family and friends. He then also, he put a very, I won't say a rhetorical question, he just put a question, let it hang in the air really, and that is that he said, why are we not studying more on non-verbal communication? He said that everybody can read minds, and that everybody can use the techniques around non-verbal communication in sales, in influence, in leadership, etc. He spoke about the GROW model. Now, my understanding of the GROW model was different to his, and I also am a very, very avid user of the one that I use, but particularly the one that he says is G is for goal, R is for reality, that you need to consider your existing reality and where you want it to go. He said O is for obstacle, is that you need to preempt the obstacles and figure out how you're going to get around them. And then finally he said W is for willpower. So why do you want this? What are you willing to do in order to get there? Then he also then went on to say we need to be very careful of being digitally distracted, particularly at the moment. A lot of people's screens are their connection to the outside world, and while that is healthy, we also have to be considerate of what digital behaviour is unhealthy, and particularly around possible addictions to phones and screen time and so on. And we need to be, I suppose, cognizant and disciplined around both of those. An interesting quote he said is that he said, he teaches and he hypnotizes people for a living, but yet he said he would encourage people not to walk around life in a trance. He then was asked a couple of questions. One person asked him, how do you not develop habits? So how do you not walk down a certain line of developing a habit? And particularly, of course, again, without going on about this, he then was talking about potential habits that people could be forming, again, in this environment. I'll let you figure out what that means yourself, but he said how to avoid getting stuck into a rut or in unhealthy habits is, he said, get busy. If you're in business, look at what your competitors are doing. He said it's very important also to sleep. And it's very important to be excited about succeeding with those goals and dreams. An interesting statistic that, he works with a lot of seriously high-performing athletes. He said that the athletes who don't sleep at least 7 hours a night are 20% more prone to injuries. Another person asked about sleep hypnosis, and he said to go online. He said that there's lots and lots of them out there, but whatever one that you choose to listen to before you go to sleep is make sure that you like their voice. Then he recommended The Rabbit Who Wants to Fall Asleep for anybody that has kids who maybe need some sort of guided meditation to get them to sleep. Another person asked the question, what's the best way to get into NLP? Again, he said another book, and he said Get the Life You Want by Richard Bandler. That was the one that he recommended. He was then asked a question, how can you adapt to other people's ways but still be authentic? He said, first of all, it's possible. He said, don't exactly mirror anybody, because he said that's kind of weird. But he says to change your breathing, your pitch, your tone to the person who you're potentially selling to, influencing whoever. But then he said also, he said that builds rapport, but also most people like themselves, and as they should, of course. And then he said, if you're mirroring somebody else, then that is something, as long as they like themselves, that's something that can be a good thing to do. And he talks about it in that way, but he said it's very important, like, to do that as a technique, but still to retain your authentic self. That's critical. And then the final thing was that somebody asked him, what are your thoughts on using words for reprogramming your subconscious? He said affirmations are really important, but he says only affirm what you believe. And he spoke about a technique that he uses himself, but also recommends to other high-performing people, which is in a cold shower, to scream out those words, I believe I can X, Y and Z, and scream it like you believe it. And then he also said try is a fail word. He said there's no room for trial. He said you go and you do it, and that's that. And then he finished up by saying every goal that he set for himself, he's achieved it. Best wishes, everyone. Bye.